All right, so tonight, if you want to open up your Bible to Leviticus 25, stick a marker in Leviticus 25 because that's going to be our main text for the Sabbath year. The Sabbath year goes down through about verse 7, and then the Jubilee starts in verse 8 and goes all the way to the end of chapter 25. There's a couple other passages that deal with the Sabbath year and the Jubilee, but that's going to be your main one. I put on Facebook yesterday, I think, to read Leviticus 25. If you had a chance to do that, great. If not, maybe whenever our class is done, or I guess in this setting, you won't be able to participate with the comments as well, but you could go ahead and pause the video, I think, and read Leviticus 25 before we get started. But what I want to do, let me just kind of start with a little overview of what we're doing. We're talking about God's rest, God's peace, and I got this thing today. I'll see if I can throw it up here. I got this in a text message. It's the St. Louis County Health Department. They've been sending about one text message a day. And today's text message says, stress and coping. Everyone reacts differently to stressful situations. Stress during an infectious disease outbreak can include fear and worry about your own health and the health of your loved ones, changes in sleep and eating patterns, concentration problems, worsening of health problems, all kinds of different stuff with that. And so that really is, that's a lot of what we're talking about in this study, is trying to be people who are at peace and rest, who can be calm in our soul, who can be still. But, what I'm not wanting to do is I'm not looking for the Band-Aid fix. And what I mean by the Band-Aid fix is my problem personally. My big thing has been my sleep. I haven't been sleeping very good. Almost every single night, I'm awake at 2, either because I haven't fallen asleep yet or because I woke up and I can't go back to sleeping. My sleep is real messed up. And I think the biggest thing with me, it's not any sort of fear about our big world situation. The biggest thing with me is stuff like this, like the technology. I am just so constantly stressed out about trying to figure out this technology stuff and all of this. And so, some of the things that I do, I'll take my dog for a walk, and try to listen to. I've got a playlist in Spotify called Easy Music, and I'll just try and slow my heart rate. I'll try and calm down. I'll try and take some deep breaths and just all kinds of stuff to clear my head. And that's those things that I'm talking about. That's Band-Aid fixes. That's trying to fix the stress and the anxiety for the moment right now because I'm nervous about technology. That's not what we're doing in this class. What we're doing is we're talking about how to undo the consequences of sin in Genesis chapter 3 that have destroyed the rest and the fellowship that God intended from all creation from the beginning of time. And really what we're trying to do is we're thinking about that big sense of ultimate peace with God. Maybe even we would call that salvation or something like that. But that's just sort of an overview of where we're coming from, what we're trying to accomplish. And Adam, I'll stop here for a second if you want to say anything before we get started into the Sabbath year and the Jubilee.
Well, when you talk about Band-Aid fixes versus the real fix, it sort of brought me to the story in the Gospels of the storm at sea and the disciples worrying about that. And it's like, would it have been effective if they would have tried to calm themselves and taken some deep breaths and told themselves that, there are lots of storms every year and most of the time people make it out fine. Like maybe there's some benefit to some of those things and there's nothing wrong with it, but how much more immediate and deep and lasting and successful was the peace that they received when they just went down and talked to Jesus and let him solve the problem.
Yeah.
I think it's the difference between those two approaches. That's what we're trying to push towards, is just learning to really look to God during this time.
Yeah. Awesome. Great comments. Okay, so last time what we did was we talked about the Sabbath rest. Obviously, that's going to be a huge part of this conversation because you've got rest. That's what we're looking for. And the Sabbath rest is God giving us a taste of that. And so last time, basically, what we did was we talked about the day. You've got Sunday through Friday, days that you can work, but then Saturday, the Sabbath, is a day where God will, there's two things, where God will provide for his people so they don't have to be concerned with the daily ins and outs trying to fight and manage your survival so that we can enjoy unhindered rest and fellowship with God. So that's a week. And the Sabbath day was a piece of that. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the Sabbath year. And you can see it. I want to go ahead. Adam, I'm curious. I've been doing a ton of the reading here. Do you happen to have a Bible in front of you? Or are you watching all the comments? Would you rather if I did the reading or if I asked you to read some?
I'm happy to read.
Okay. Would you mind reading Leviticus 25 and verses 1 through 7? This is our introduction to the Sabbath year, not the Sabbath day.
All right, Leviticus 25, starting in verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land that I give you, the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years you shall sow your field, and for 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in its fruits. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap what grows of itself in your harvest or gather the grapes of your undressed vine. It shall be a year of solemn rest for the land. The Sabbath of the land shall provide food for yourself and for your male and female slaves, and for your hired worker and the sojourner who lives with you, and for your cattle and for the wild animals that are in your land. All its yield shall be for food."
Okay. So what I've done here at the start is I have basically said there's three main elements to the Sabbath year. And, I'm sure if you wanted to watch me carefully, somebody could probably say, well, what about this or what about this? But look, big picture stuff, there's three main things. Number one, God says, let the land rest. Let the land lay fallow for an entire year. First of all, this is just a huge, imagine in Exodus 16, remember there were people who went out to try and gather food on the Sabbath day because they wanted to go out and get their food because they couldn't just rest for one day. I don't really feel like you're asking somebody for a huge leap of faith. It's not like you're going to starve after one day. Can you imagine, though, God saying to his people, here's what we're going to do. It's just like the Sabbath week and the Sabbath day situation. God says, for 6 years you're going to work, and on the 6th year, I'm going to give you enough food to save up so that you don't have to work the land and farm to survive for an entire year. And you know what? There's even more to that. It's not even just, I'm going to provide for you for an entire year when you don't have to work the land. Imagine if you're not working the land for that year, that's going to affect you as you move forward into year 8 too, because you didn't work the land. You're not going to have extra stuff coming up. Can you imagine that? I mean, God is constantly just asking his people for faith. But this idea of, I'm going to provide for you so that we can enjoy unhindered fellowship, the Sabbath day, okay. I don't really feel like that one's hard. This one, though, really stretches me. When you think about if I was a Jew living in these circumstances, I probably would have had a tough time with this one.
Yeah, it's a big jump to go from a day off to a year off. And I was just trying to put myself in those shoes a little bit of what it would be if I knew, for instance, that in 2021, you're not going to work. And it's just going to be special time for you and God. And just thinking about, okay, my natural instinct then would be, well, let me make sure that I'm prepared and I'm storing up and try to sort of compensate with self-reliance. But I think the whole idea is to trust that God's going to take care of his people during this time, just like he did with manna from heaven and water from the rock. And he's always been trying to train them in the Old Testament to trust him. And now it's a big leap to take a whole year off and spend that time with God every seventh year too. So it's not infrequently.
Yeah, boy, tough one. I will divert from my notes here just for a second, since we're talking about this. In Leviticus 25, starting in verse 20, and if you say, what shall we eat in the 7th year? If we may not sow or gather in our crops, I will command my blessing on you in the 6th year, so that it will produce a crop sufficient for 3 years. And when you sow in the 8th year, you will be eating some food from the old crop. You shall eat of the old until the 9th year when its crop arrives. I would think the reason why I went there now is just because listening to you talk and thinking about this before we even start on the point, I would think right now that this is a pretty practical thing as we're thinking about the economy and the work circumstances. Like, I love the way that you talked about it. God training his people to trust him, to provide. Seems like that's going to be a useful skill right about now.
For sure. And I just dropped an impromptu question in the chat just to get your all's feedback of what it would be like to try to even imagine taking a year off to spend that time with God, and what the challenges could be or what the opportunities could be. Because I think we can read this and think of it as something that we're pretty far removed from, but to actually put yourself in those shoes, you start to see the amount of trust that's required.
Yeah. Wow. As people are coming in with those comments, I'm going to talk about this land for a second. Well, the very first thing that jumps out at me when I read Leviticus 25 and 1 through 7 is, I'm going to have a Sabbath for the land, so that the land I give you can keep a Sabbath. I'm going to go to a couple different passages here. I'll just tell you honestly, I'm not entirely sure what to make of this point, but I know that it's a point to be made. And that is to see the connection between man, humanity, and the land in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 5, when no bush of the field was yet in the land, and no small plant of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the land. And there was no man. That man, the Hebrew word there for man is Adam. I don't know, it's Hebrew, Adam. Probably something like that. There was no man to work the ground. It's a play on words. There's no Adam to work the Adamah. And a mist was going up from the land and was watering the whole face of the ground. Then the Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. So from the very start of human existence, you have this intimate connection between humanity, mankind, and the land from which he came, which I think helps us to appreciate whenever Adam and Eve sin in the garden, God curses the serpent, God curses the woman, but then when it comes time for Adam to pay his dues, in Genesis 3:17, to Adam God said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. And so, when we're thinking about sin and the trouble that we experience, the stress, the anxiety, the lack of rest, the separation from God, the death, all of those things, when we think about all of that stuff that we experience, in some way or another, the land is a huge part of that. We were made from the land. The land was cursed because of our sin. And then I'll just say one more thing, and then I'll be quiet here and give you some space, Adam. In Romans chapter 8, Romans chapter 8 is the passage where Paul talks about the Holy Spirit groaning on our behalf. But the Holy Spirit groaning for us is not the only one groaning in this chapter. In Romans 8, starting in verse 19, for the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God, For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from the bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And so, I'm not entirely sure what to make of this connection, but the ground is suffering the consequences of our sin, just like we're suffering the consequences of our sin. And just like we have a time of rest where God's going to provide so that we can have unhindered fellowship with him, in Leviticus 25, he says, so during this 7th year, the land is going to have a Sabbath year. It's like a total, I shouldn't say total, it's like a big scale undoing of the curse and the consequences of sin.
Exactly. And that's actually a really nice transition to a couple of the comments I was going to share, I guess, starting with Amanda's, who said something very similar, that in Genesis 3, the land was cursed so that man would have to work it. Now it's reverted, and that curse is at least partially undone, so that God's going to take care of them for a year. Steve Shetla talked about Israel having a tough time with keeping the Sabbath law, and as far as we know, they never observed it, and the captivity ended up being that Sabbath period for the land, which I think we're going to talk about a little later. And just one more from Bob West, talking about what it would be like to take a year off, and saying, hopefully we won't take a full year off with this, but yet we're drawing the same conclusion, and that is to trust God.
Yeah.
I'll just share one thought that I had about the Sabbath year, because most of the time I don't think about the Sabbath, and if I do, it's the day. The year, as I was sort of reading it, I thought, this is kind of a lot. And it is almost like intrusive is the word that came to mind, to think like you want every 7th year for us to just stop. And maybe that's because I've started to understand a little more about what it is to stop, and the fact that things slow down and that you have a lot of time and reflection. And I felt like, okay, sometimes I feel like it's been good, but it's been 3 or 4 weeks. Let's go. And to think about doing that for a year and doing it repeatedly, it seems like a lot to ask. But then I sort of flipped that on myself and said, well, shouldn't I be viewing it as a great opportunity for unfettered time with God, and to take what you would get in a day of slow, focused time with God and to stretch that out over a year? It could be great if it was really used the right way.
Yeah. Boy, this one's a little tougher. Just one more thing is, before we leave this, about let the land rest. At the very end of Leviticus 25, there in verse 6, the Sabbath of the land shall provide food for you, for yourself, and he mentions, for your male and your female slaves, for your hired servant, the sojourner who lives with you, for your cattle, and for the wild animals who are in your land. All its yield shall be food for you. The thing is that this Sabbath rest this year, it's for everybody, from the greatest to the least, even the animals of the land. There is one exception. It's not for everybody across the board, but it's for everybody up and down the social scale, that's for sure. Okay, number 2 then, Sabbath year is not just a time to let the land lay fallow. Incidentally, I'm sure that somebody's thinking this, and it's going to drive you nuts if I don't say it, with the land laying fallow. It just shows the wisdom of God, and not overworking the land, and just what we would call maybe modern ideas of farming and taking care of stuff. God knows what he's talking about. Okay, number 2. There is this time of a release of debt. I'm going to go to Deuteronomy 15 here. In Deuteronomy 15 and verses 1 through 3, at the end of every 7 years, you shall grant a release. Now, Adam, this is what you were asking about. If this is a neat study, if somebody wants to do this, get into some different Bible translations and compare Deuteronomy 15 verses 1 through 3 and how those translations treat the word release. Specifically, there's one in the NIV. It says, at the end of every 7 years, you must cancel debts. I'm thinking that's probably not an accurate picture. It's not a total cancellation of all debts. It's a release from debt in the sense of the debt is not gone, but this year we're not working, so I'm not going to make you pay your debt this year. And that, I think, is going to make more sense whenever we start talking about the Jubilee, because in the Jubilee, there is actually an outright cancellation, wiping the slate clean. This one seems to be more of a common sense, nobody's working, don't force them to pay their bills. Anyway, I stopped short. Verse 1, at the end of every 7 years you shall grant a release, and this is the manner of the release. Every creditor shall release what he has lent to his neighbor. He shall not exact it of his neighbor, his brother, because the Lord's release has been proclaimed. Of a foreigner you may exact it, but whatever of yours is with your brother, your hand shall release it. And that's the one exception that I was mentioning just a little bit ago. If you want to be a part of this rest, the peace and the security that God intended, this is for God's people. This is not for foreigners or outsiders. They're not a part of this great release. So the second major thing that I would just throw out there is let your land lay fallow for an entire year, and don't hold people to their debts for that year also. Got anything on that one?
Just one thing that I would add that I noticed in this Deuteronomy 15 passage. In verse 11, the instruction towards the end of the verse is, you shall open wide your hand to your brother, to the needy and to the poor in your land. And I just thought it was interesting in this conversation about what happens when people stop working for a while. The instruction is included, make sure you look out for your brother and any poor and any needy, and that you make sure that they're not suffering during this time. And as we see ourselves in somewhat of a similar situation and a rest and a pause, and many people aren't working or aren't working to the same amount, just a good reminder that it's always been a part of God's plan. We take care of each other. We look out for the needy among us. And I love the picture of having the open hand. Whatever I have is yours, and I'd be happy to give it to you.
Yeah. One thing that irritates me about that passage in verse 11 that you refer to, that for there will never cease to be the poor in the land. I think it's in Matthew 26 where Jesus says that. And the way I hear people refer to that passage all the time is, Jesus said you'll never stop having poor people. And so their usage of that passage is, there's always going to be poor people. What am I supposed to do about it? That's kind of the opposite, though, of what God is intending when he says it in the first place. He says there's always going to be poor people, so you always be busy helping out the people who need help. Anyway, I get wound up about that stuff. Okay, number 3. This is another thing that's really interesting. Deuteronomy 31 and verse 9. Deuteronomy 31, verse 9. I'm going to read 9 to 13. Then Moses wrote this law and gave it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel. And Moses commanded them, at the end of every 7 years, at the set time, in the year of release, at the Feast of Booths, so that's what we're talking about here, the year of release at the Feast of Booths, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God at the place that he will choose, you shall read this law before all Israel in their hearing. Assemble the people, men, women, little ones, and the sojourner within your towns. There it is again. This is for everybody. Men, women, little ones, a sojourner, that they may hear and learn to fear the Lord your God and be careful to do all the words of his law, and that their children who have not known it may hear and learn to fear the Lord their God, as long as you live in the land that you're going over the Jordan to possess. And so, there's lots of conversation about this. Is he talking about read Genesis through Deuteronomy? Is he only talking about reading Deuteronomy? I don't know the answer to that question. I tend to think he's just saying read the book of Deuteronomy every 7 years. But the idea is every 7 years, we're going to put our lives and our faith totally, entirely in God's hands. We're going to release debts and help people out and not hold people to the stuff that they owe us. And we're going to turn our attention and devote ourselves entirely to God and what he said for this year. This is what I'm talking about at the start of this lesson. This is not, I'm going to take my dog for a walk and clear my head. This is, I'm going to take a whole year to get right and to enjoy that sense, at least a taste of that sense of fellowship with God that he intended from the start.
Yeah, one thing that I had jotted down here is God knows the value of a forced slowdown in life. And I think we're kind of slowly coming around to realizing the value of when something sort of bigger than yourself forces us to slow down. All of a sudden, we sort of realize some of our blessings. We might think about spiritual things more often. This was a built-in part of God's plan, is that every seventh year there was going to be this pause and this time to reconnect with him, in addition to the once a week and in addition to all the other ways that were already mapped out.
Yeah, cool. All right, just let me throw out a couple passages here. I'm not going to read these, but you may be interested to do them. I would type it, but I'm afraid that I'm going to break something if I start clicking some stuff on here. But there's a couple different places where people talk about rereading the law. And one of those is in Deuteronomy 17, verses 18 through 20. The king, whenever you come into the land and you say, we want a king like everybody else in the king is to write the law for himself. Those passages are a really great place, Deuteronomy 17, 18 to 20, because it tells you the reason why. So that he can know God's law, so that he can know how to serve God, so that he can observe the law and all these things. That's a good place to see the why. And Steve, you mentioned the thing about we don't know if anybody actually observed the Sabbath year. There's one passage worth looking at in Jeremiah 34 and verse 8. The people at least started. They knew that it was there and they were thinking about doing it, but when you get to verse 11, they stopped. So I'm with you. We don't know that they actually observed it, but at least it was something that was on Israel's mind moving forward. Anything else you want to say before I go ahead and move into the Jubilee?
No, I think I'm good.
Okay. Hey, let me ask you a question. I'm really sorry to do this right now. Is there a ton of background noise coming through? Because my window is open next to me and it seems like a hurricane is deciding to start blowing.
Oh, no, I haven't really.
Okay, good deal. I'll keep going then. All right.
Yep.
The Jubilee starts in Leviticus chapter 25 and beginning in verse 8 all the way down through the end of the chapter. And there's four main elements of the Jubilee, and I'm not going to spend as much time on all of these, but I'll just go through them really quickly. Leviticus 25, starting in verse 10. You shall consecrate the 50th year. So what we're doing with the Jubilee, I should probably start with this. Every 7 years, you've got the Sabbath year. And then you put 7 of those together. So every 49 years, you've got the 7th year, the Sabbath year. But then the 50th year is a double. That's the Jubilee. So verse 10. You shall consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you when each of you shall return to his property, and each of you shall return to his clan. In verse 13, in this year of jubilee, each of you shall return to his property. And so the first thing is the idea of returning to the land. Any land that I've purchased in the last 49 years potentially, when the Jubilee comes, what I do is I take that land and I say, okay, Adam, I bought this from you. I bought this from your family. And even though I own it fair and square now, the Jubilee is here. I'm giving it back to you. And so there's this big picture of returning to the land. I'm curious, what goes through your head when you think about that? Like, are you happy about that or are you upset about that?
Well, I could probably, my business school education says that you need to make sure to factor in how many years away from the Jubilee you are before you do any transactions. But more practically, I think I noticed reading through the chapter how God will say, the land can't be sold in perpetuity because the land is mine. Yeah. And I think he was getting at the idea that everything that you do in your dealings will eventually, I'm going to reset the deck. And I think is part of that about giving people back their inheritance and kind of the plot of land that would have come with every family and kind of always preserving a possession for them.
What's that part there? I'm sorry, the last question.
Just is part of the idea that every family in Israel is supposed to have some part of the promised land that belongs to them.
Yeah, I mean, at the very beginning, it was supposed to be that way. And so you would think, at the end of Deuteronomy, moving into Joshua, you've got the story about the daughters of Zelophehad. And they were upset because, they didn't have any men in the family to get the land. And so what a great story about what you're talking about right now. Moses makes these, provisions in the law to say, yes, even you daughters, even though you as women can't be landowners, you don't have any other way to have a little taste of your toe in the promised land, so here's your piece. So yeah, I'm really glad that you said the word reset too. That would be the thing that crossed my mind. Especially since we're thinking in big Christianity terms right now. When the year of Jubilee comes, what we're thinking is big scale national reset, which is kind of what we're hoping for, right? We have the rest in Genesis chapter 2 that God intended, and then humanity messed it up in Genesis 3, and the picture of the Jubilee is reset. We're going back to the land. So yeah. Is there anything in the comments or anything that you want to say before I move on to my next point there?
Yeah, there's one comment that I'll share from Denise Campbell, who said both on the idea of the Sabbath and probably the Jubilee as well as we move into that it's somewhat a shame that God had to provide a whole year to remind them of what they should be doing daily to worship God and to keep his commandments. The same applies to us. We shouldn't have to wait for a calamity to remember God.
Yeah. All right, well, I'm going to keep on rolling here. The next thing that goes with the Jubilee is the land has rest. Again, this is the same kind of thing as within the Sabbath year. Leviticus 25 verses 11 and 12. The 50th year shall be a Jubilee for you. In it you shall neither sow nor reap what grows of itself, nor gather the grapes from the undressed vines. For it is a Jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You may eat the produce you feel. And so, again, the land gets rest. We're moving away from the consequences and the burdens of sin. The next one is the freedom of slaves. This one is huge. Look at verses 8 through 10. You shall count 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the time of the 7 weeks of 7 years shall give you 49 years. Then you shall sound the loud trumpet on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the day of atonement, you shall sound the trumpet throughout all the land, and you shall consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty. There's 2 words in the Hebrew Bible for Jubilee. The first word, Jubilee, sounds like the horn that you blow during this time, but the other word for Jubilee is liberty. And so this period of Jubilee is literally called the liberty, the period of liberty. It's the time when slaves are set free. Look at verse 47, 25:47. If a stranger or sojourner with you becomes rich, and your brother beside him becomes poor, and so you've got a stranger in the land, not an Israelite, but a Jewish brother becomes poor and sells himself to the Israelite, then this is what's going to happen. Jump down just for the sake of time to verses 54 and 55. If he is not redeemed, he and his children with him shall be released in the year of Jubilee. For it is to me that the people of Israel are servants. They are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. This one is just fascinating to me too, because if a Jewish person has such a huge debt that they have to sell themselves to a non-Jew, the non-Jew has to release that Jewish slave in the year of Jubilee. Now, how do you convince a non-Jew who's not observing these laws and celebrating these things to release their slaves on the 7th year? And I'm not sure that it is so much about convincing the sojourner in the land, so much as it is the time of Jubilee is a time to remember that God delivers his people from slavery, and especially from Egypt. And so it's kind of like, listen, maybe they'll abide and release the slaves, but even if they don't worry about it. God's got you. He's going to find a way to take care of this. Anything else before I move on?
Not really. You just have to think what a time of rejoicing and joy this would be if it was ever really kept, which we don't know that it was, but this vision of the trumpet being sounded and the land going back to its sort of rightful owner and time spent with God and the slaves being freed and going to get talking about debts being canceled. Like it just was a beautiful picture of God setting everything right.
Yeah. And I mean, you've gone ahead and said it. Let's just go ahead and start thinking about it now. Can you think of anything else in the Bible where the trumpet is going to sound and the land is going to be saved from the oppression of sin? All debts are going to be released. The land is going to go back to the way that it should have been in God's intent. The slaves are going to be freed. I mean, how can you not think about salvation through Jesus now, but especially at the end? I got a couple passages that I wrote down here with that. 1 Corinthians 15:52, 1 Thessalonians 4:16, the trumpet's going to be sounded. In both of those passages, the idea of overcoming death is the main theme when that trumpet sounds, and death is the main curse. One last thing, all debts are going to be canceled. Now this one is actual ultimate cancellation. And one thing that I'll just say quickly about this, in Leviticus 25 and verse 39, pay careful attention to the words. It says, if your brother becomes poor beside you and sells himself to you. Now here's something you need to know. A Jewish person cannot own another Jewish person as a slave. We can do slavery with non-Jews. Non-Jews can own Jewish slaves, but Jews cannot own other Jews, your brother, as slaves. It says, you shall not make him serve as a slave. He shall be with you as a hired servant. And as a sojourner, he shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee. And so, Adam, you and I are brothers. I become poor and indebted to you. You're not going to own me as a slave, but essentially, you own me as a hired worker. I have to work for you to pay off my debt. But when the year of Jubilee comes, that debt is wiped clean and I'm a free man. I mean, if you're a Christian and you're not thinking salvation thoughts right about now, there's something really wrong. All right, I'm going to move into the last thing. If you don't have any comments or extra stuff that you want to say about this, I'll just read maybe one more passage and then we'll start wrapping this up for the night.
Yeah, no, let's get to the best part here.
Yes, Luke chapter 4. In Luke chapter 4, I wish that we had a little bit more time so that we could actually set this up in the context of the Gospel of Luke. But just for the sake of time, this is the start of Jesus' ministry in the Gospel of Luke. And so, at least in terms of what's happening in Luke and Acts, the text that we're about to read right now is like the main point, the main theme of who Jesus is and what Jesus came to do. Do you want to read it for us, Adam? Luke 4, verses 16 to 21.
Sure. And he came to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and as was his custom, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day. And he stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll and gave it back to the attendant and sat down. and the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. And he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing."
So listen to some of these things. To proclaim good news to the poor. That sounds a lot like what we've been talking about. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives. That's almost a direct quote from Leviticus chapter 25. It's the year of liberty, Jubilee. The recovering of sight to the blind, to set liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. What Jesus is saying, and everybody knew it, and this was the thing that was so astonishing. What Jesus was saying is the Sabbath day, unhindered fellowship with God, the Sabbath year, about the land resting, undoing the curses of sin, the releasing of debt, and especially this proclaiming the year of the Lord's favor, the Jubilee. We're going to have this big scale reset. Slaves are going to be free. Debts are going to be canceled. Jesus rolls up the scroll and he looks at everybody in the synagogue and he says, "That's me." And can you imagine everybody sitting there being like, who does this guy think he is?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's what we're talking about in this class. We're not talking about, I'm stressed out because technology and I need to take my dog for a walk to clear my head. And we're not talking about Sabbath stuff. Here are the rules that you have to follow. You can't work on Saturday. That's not what this is about. This is about undoing the consequences and the curses of sin and going back to the original intent to be at rest and in perfect, unhindered fellowship with God. And then when we get that part right, the stressing about technology, who even cares? You know what I mean? Like my eternity, I'm with my Creator. Who cares if my PowerPoint stops working? Anyway, I think I'm about wrapped up here, Adam. I'll give you the last word, or if there's any comments, and then we can be done for tonight.
Yeah, I'd never seen all of this so clearly until the way that we kind of walked through it tonight, of Jesus really being the one to give rest, to set the slaves free, to be the Lord's favor, and to be the one who brings us into fellowship with him. I feel like the first half hour or so where we walked through what all of that looked like in the Old Testament was really just, for us now, is setting a picture of what God had in mind and of the ideal state of his people. And now to think that it's no longer a day, it's no longer a year, it's no longer 2 years back to back, but that we can have continual, ongoing fellowship and freedom and forgiveness and hope and celebration. And all of these things that we've looked at just puts things in a new perspective for me.
Yeah. I'm seeing in the comments over here, Amanda, I'm imagining that, Amanda, I think very highly of you, but this sounds like something that Kevin would say. When Jesus responded to the Pharisees and he said, "I'm the Lord of the Sabbath," he's not saying to the Pharisees, "I'm God, I can do whatever I want." He's saying, this Sabbath concept that we're talking about, that's me. I'm the guy. This is where you find the rest that all of this Sabbath stuff points to and leads to. And so, I know that we don't offer an invitation right now, but if you happen to be watching and you're not a Christian, or if you're watching and you are a Christian, but you've not been living in the way that you know you ought to be living, I don't know how anybody would voluntarily turn their back on what Jesus is offering here. It's time to come to Jesus, to bow the knee, to say, "You are the Lord of the Sabbath. Give me the rest that you came to provide."